The silent disappearance of people who woke up from the system. The warning. Nobody is talking about. Have you ever noticed someone change, not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, quietly, in a way that's difficult to name? They're still there, still showing up to the same places, still participating in the same conversations, still going through the same routines. But something has shifted, something fundamental. It's as if the person you knew has pulled back from behind their own eyes and is watching everything, including themselves, from a new distance. They smile at the right moments. They say the right things. But there's a quality of detachment underneath it all, a sense that they are participating in something they no longer quite believe in, and that they know it, and that the knowledge has changed them in ways that can't be undone. You might have noticed this in someone close to you, or you might have noticed it in yourself. This isn't depression, though it can look like depression from the outside. It isn't antisocial behavior, though it can be misread that way. It is something more specific and more significant. The experience of a person who has seen through a layer of reality they previously accepted without question, and who cannot unsee what they've seen. We are living through a moment when this experience is becoming more common than at any previous point in history. Not because people are becoming more enlightened. The process is more complicated and more ambiguous than that word implies. But because the systems that shape modern life have become simultaneously more powerful, more visible in their mechanisms, and more clearly disconnected from the well-being of the people inside them. And as that disconnection becomes impossible to ignore, more and more people are quietly stepping back from the collective performance. Not with protest, not with manifestos, but with a kind of silent, irreversible withdrawal. This is what we're going to examine today. Not as a trend to celebrate or mourn, but as a phenomenon to understand, because what happens to these people and why it happens and what it means for the society they're disappearing from is one of the most important and least discussed questions of our time. What waking up actually means first, let's be precise about what we mean and what we don't mean. When we talk about people waking up from the system, the phrase has been claimed by so many different groups, attached to so many different ideologies and belief systems, that it has become almost meaningless through overuse. People use it to describe everything from genuine critical insight to elaborate conspiracy theories, from authentic philosophical awakening to tribal groupthink with a different label. The fact that the same phrase describes all of these things suggests we need more precision than the phrase itself provides. What actually happens, the real phenomenon underneath all the different names and frames that get applied to it, is something more specific and more verifiable than most of the uses of the phrase imply. It is the experience of becoming genuinely aware of the constructed nature of social reality, the realization, arrived at through one's own observation and reflection, that much of what is presented as natural, inevitable, or simply the way things are is in fact a specific arrangement that serves specific interests that could be otherwise, and that depends for its continuation on the unconscious participation of the people inside it. This realization can arrive through many routes. Sometimes it's a personal crisis, a job loss, a divorce, a serious illness, a bereavement that strips away the comforting routines and forces a confrontation with questions that were previously easy to avoid. Sometimes it's a gradual accumulation of small observations that don't quite fit the official story, mounting over years until the weight of them becomes impossible to dismiss. Sometimes it's a single encounter with an idea, a book, a conversation, a piece of journalism that makes visible something that was always there but had never been clearly seen. Whatever the route, the arrival point tends to be similar. The person begins to see the systems around them, economic, political, media, social, not as neutral environments they simply inhabit, but as structured arrangements that actively shape their perceptions, desires, and choices in ways they never consciously chose and were never explicitly told about. They begin to notice the gap between what these systems claim to be and what they actually do, between the values they espouse and the incentives they actually operate according to, between the picture of reality they present and what the evidence actually shows. And once seen, this gap cannot be unseen. That's the defining characteristic of the experience. You can choose not to talk about it. You can choose how to respond to it, but you cannot return to the state of not having noticed it. Something has shifted in the relationship between the person and the world they inhabit, and that shift is permanent. The first stage, the vertigo. The initial experience of this awakening is rarely comfortable. In fact, for most people, the first stage is characterized by something closer to vertigo. A disorienting sense that the ground beneath one's feet is less solid than it appeared. This is psychologically predictable, and understanding why helps illuminate what's actually happening. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We don't simply experience raw reality, we experience reality through frameworks of interpretation, through narratives that organize our perceptions into something coherent and navigable. These frameworks are built up over a lifetime, shaped by family, culture, education, religion, peer groups, and the broader society we're born into. They feel less like interpretations and more like simple reality because they're so deeply embedded in how we perceive everything else that we rarely notice them as frameworks at all. They're the water we swim in. When a framework begins to crack, when the evidence accumulating in your own experience begins to contradict the story the framework has been telling you, the experience is not primarily intellectual, it's visceral. It produces anxiety, confusion, a destabilizing sense that things you relied on without realizing you were relying on them are no longer solid. The comfort that came from unquestioned certainty is gone, and what replaces it at first is not clarity, but disorientation. This is one of the reasons why the awakening is often triggered or accelerated by crisis. Crisis strips away the routines and distractions that normally allow people to avoid engaging with the questions that would, if genuinely examined, destabilize their frameworks. A person who is doing well by conventional measures, employed, socially connected, financially stable, has little practical pressure to question the frameworks that have produced that conventional well-being. A person whose life has been disrupted in ways that those frameworks cannot adequately explain or help them navigate is suddenly much more open to the possibility that the frameworks themselves are part of the problem. The vertigo stage is also characterized by a loss of automatic social ease. Social interaction depends, to a degree we rarely appreciate, on shared frameworks, on both parties operating inside common assumptions about what is real, what matters, what constitutes success, what the point of things is. When those shared assumptions begin to dissolve for one party, the interaction becomes subtly but unmistakably harder. The awakening person finds themselves in conversations where they are saying the expected things, performing the expected role, while internally experiencing a growing disconnect between what they're saying and what they actually think. This is the beginning of the silence, not yet the withdrawal, but the first experience of the gap between internal reality and social performance that will, over time, produce the withdrawal. The second stage, the searching. The vertigo, for most people, produces a period of intense searching. Having lost confidence in the frameworks they were operating inside, they look for alternatives, for ways of understanding what's happening to them and why, for communities of people who share their growing sense that the official story doesn't quite add up. This searching is necessary and valuable. But it is also, as many people who have been through it know, genuinely dangerous, not in the dramatic sense, but in the sense that the disorientation of the awakening makes a person temporarily more susceptible to certain kinds of error than they were before. The first danger is replacement. The experience of having a framework crack open can feel so disorienting that there is enormous pressure to fill the gap with another framework as quickly as possible, to exchange one system of ready-made answers for another. The person who was a committed mainstream political partisan and who begins to see the limitations of that tribal certainty is vulnerable to being recruited into a different tribal certainty that simply rearranges which things are good and which things are bad while preserving the same fundamental structure of certainty itself. The person who has seen through the limitations of mainstream media's account of the world is vulnerable to alternative media that offers a completely inverted narrative, in which everything the mainstream says is false and everything the alternative says is true, which is simply a mirror image of the same epistemological failure. This is why so many journeys of genuine awakening end up, paradoxically, in new forms of rigidity. The person has genuinely seen something true, that the frameworks they were operating inside were limited, distorted, and serving interests that were not their own. But the insight that frameworks are limited and distorted is itself quickly captured by a new framework, and the cycle continues. The search for certainty, which the original awakening disrupted, reasserts itself in a new guise. The second danger is isolation. The searching period often involves discovering communities of people who share the emerging awareness, and this discovery can be genuinely valuable. Finding others who see what you see, who can help you articulate what you're experiencing and work through its implications is an important part of the process. But these communities are also, like all human communities, subject to their own dynamics of conformity and exclusion. They develop their own orthodoxies, their own shibboleths, their own ways of distinguishing the genuinely awakened from the insufficiently awakened. And the person who has just escaped one form of social conformity pressure may find themselves, without fully realizing it, inside another one with different content but similar structure. The third danger, perhaps the most significant, is what we might call premature closure. The discomfort of the searching stage is real, and the impulse to resolve it is understandable. But genuine understanding of complex systems takes time and continued engagement with evidence and argument that doesn't simply confirm what you already want to believe. Arriving at conclusions too quickly, before that engagement has been sufficiently thorough and honest, produces the sense of having understood something without the actual understanding that would make the sense reliable. The people who navigate the searching stage most successfully are those who can maintain what might be called disciplined openness, continuing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, continuing to take seriously perspectives that challenge their emerging conclusions, continuing to acknowledge what they don't know, while simultaneously not allowing that openness to become a reason for never arriving at any conclusions at all. It's a difficult balance to maintain, especially in conditions where social pressure is pushing toward one premature closure or another. A pause worth taking. I want to stop here and ask something directly, because this is where the experience becomes personal. If you're watching this, there's a reasonable chance that some version of what I've been describing resonates with your own experience. Maybe you felt the vertigo. Maybe you've been through the searching. Maybe you're in the middle of it right now. That unsettled, between frameworks feeling of having seen through something you can't quite name, without yet having a clear sense of what understanding actually looks like on the other side of it. If that's where you are, I want to say something directly. The discomfort is real and it's significant, but it's not evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're taking something seriously that deserves to be taken seriously. The frameworks that shaped your previous certainty were not adequate to the world as it actually is. The process of finding ones that are more adequate is genuinely difficult and genuinely takes time. Share in the comments. If you're in the vertigo stage, say so. If you've been through the searching and come out somewhere, describe where. If you're still searching, describe what the search looks like. These conversations matter, and they matter more when they're honest about where people actually are, rather than performing certainty about where they think they should be. The third stage, the quiet withdrawal. For many people who move through the vertigo and the searching, what emerges on the other side is not a new certainty, not a clean replacement framework that restores the comfort of unquestioned answers, but something more ambiguous and more durable, a changed relationship to the social world and to the systems that shape it. And the most visible outward expression of this changed relationship is the withdrawal. Not a dramatic withdrawal, not the public renunciation, not the visible rejection of everything that came before, but a quiet, gradual, often barely noticeable pulling back from enthusiastic participation in the games that the social world runs on. They stop competing seriously for the status markers that their social world treats as valuable, not because they've decided that achievement is worthless, but because they can no longer quite convince themselves that the specific achievements their world rewards are worth what it costs to pursue them. They reduce their presence on social media not with a dramatic announcement about why, but simply by showing up less, engaging less, performing less. They become less interested in the political conversations that once engaged them, not out of apathy, but because the conversations increasingly look like theater, the manipulation of identity and emotion in service of interests that have nothing to do with the genuine problems being nominally discussed. Their conversations change. They become deeper with the small number of people they trust completely, and more superficial with everyone else, not out of contempt, But because the energy required for genuine engagement is finite, and they're increasingly selective about where they spend it, they are still physically present in most of the same environments. But something essential has withdrawn from the collective performance. From the outside, this can look like depression or burnout or social anxiety. People close to the person often feel something has changed without being able to clearly identify what. There may be concern or frustration or the feeling that the person has become less accessible, less engaged, less present in the ways that matter. And these concerns are understandable, because from inside the frameworks that the person has partially stepped outside of, what looks like withdrawal really does look like something going wrong. But from inside the experience, it often doesn't feel that way. It feels more like a clarification, a reduction of noise, a setting aside of things that were consuming energy without producing anything genuinely valuable, a kind of relief at no longer being required to maintain a performance that was always somewhat dishonest. The withdrawal, for many people, is accompanied not by increasing sadness, but by increasing groundedness. A sense of being more truly themselves, even if themselves is harder to explain to others than the previous, more legible version was. Why society doesn't notice, and why it should hear, is the warning embedded in this phenomenon. The thing that matters far beyond the individual experience of the people going through it. When a society begins losing, at scale, the engagement of people who are paying genuine attention, who have developed real critical awareness, who have moved past the automatic acceptance of received frameworks and arrived at something more honestly examined, that society is losing something it cannot easily replace, and whose absence it may not notice until the cost has become very high. The people who undergo this awakening are not, as a group, the most cynical or the most angry members of society. They are often among the most thoughtful, the most genuinely concerned with what's actually happening, the most capable of the careful, sustained attention that addressing complex problems requires. The fact that they are withdrawing from active participation in civic and institutional life is not simply a personal story about individuals going through a difficult psychological transition. It is a structural problem for any society that needs exactly those qualities in its engaged members. And the society is, in a very specific sense, driving them out. Not through explicit persecution. The withdrawal isn't a response to danger in most cases, but to something subtler. It is a response to the experience of inhabiting social and institutional environments that consistently reward performance over substance, that punish honest complexity with reduced attention and status, that treat genuine critical thought as a problem to be managed rather than a resource to be cultivated. The people most capable of contributing the most are the ones who find these environments most alienating, because they are the ones most clearly aware of the gap between what the environments claim to be and what they actually are. This is a feedback loop with serious long-term consequences. As the most critically aware participants withdraw from institutional and civic life, those institutions become more thoroughly dominated by people who are either genuinely uncritical or strategically performing uncriticality. The quality of public reasoning declines. The capacity for honest self-examination atrophies. The systems become progressively less capable of the kind of genuine course correction that addressing real problems requires. And the conditions that drove the initial wave of thoughtful people to disengage become more pronounced, driving more people to disengage in turn. It is the intellectual and civic equivalent of topsoil loss, invisible in any given season, catastrophic over decades, and very difficult to reverse once it has progressed beyond a certain point. What the withdrawn people know. The people who have quietly stepped back from the collective performance have, in many cases, something valuable to offer, that they're no longer in the spaces where it could do the most good. It's worth being specific about what that is. They know with a clarity that most participants in institutional and political life lack, that the systems they've stepped back from are not neutral, that the incentives shaping those systems produce specific behaviors and specific outcomes that are not the same as the behaviors and outcomes those systems claim to be producing. That the gap between the official story and the actual story is significant and consequential. They know what it feels like to question frameworks that feel like reality, and to survive the disorientation of the questioning. This gives them a kind of psychological resilience, a capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to maintain direction without requiring certainty, that is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. They know from the inside what it costs to maintain honest awareness in environments that punish it. And this knowledge tends to produce a quality of genuine compassion for the people who haven't made that journey yet, not contempt for their unconsciousness, but understanding of why it's maintained and what it would take to change it. These are not small things. They are exactly the qualities that a society navigating genuine complexity, facing real challenges, trying to do better than it has done before actually needs. The tragedy is that the same conditions that produce these qualities in these people have also made them less available to the society that needs them. The path that doesn't require disappearing here is the question that follows from everything we've examined, and it's addressed directly to anyone who recognizes themselves in what we've been describing. Is there a path through this that doesn't end in permanent withdrawal? Not a path back to the unconscious participation that characterized the time before the awakening. That door is closed, and trying to walk back through it produces only a performance of unconsciousness that's more exhausting than the withdrawal, but a path forward, through the awakening rather than stopping at it, toward a different kind of engagement with the world that takes what has been genuinely learned and applies it towards something genuinely useful. This